They never realized a marriage could collapse without a single argument. In a Tudor household, where smiles cut deeper than accusations, a mistress rose without ever raising her voice. Whispers moved faster than truth. Kindness hid sharper intentions. And a wife lost a war she never knew she was fighting. Tonight, you will walk with me through the quiet steps that ended everything. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to step quietly into the private rooms of a Tudor household, it would not be the tapestries or the polished wood that caught the eye first, but the way a smile could travel across a woman's face, with the softness of morning light and the sharpness of a hidden blade. In such rooms, where warmth was carefully performed, and silence held more truth than words, a mistress's smile could pass as gentle, harmless, even comforting. It was easy to believe it meant nothing. It was easier still to believe it held no danger at all. But anyone watching closely enough would notice that the corners of her lips curved with a kind of purpose that did not belong to innocence. It was the sort of smile that existed to be seen, never to be trusted. The wives in these houses were often too weary to notice the trap woven into that quiet expression. A mistress did not arrive making noise or demands. She entered like a soft breeze. Politer, attentive, never imposing. Her smile encouraged the wife to relax. It suggested that she was no threat, that she understood her place, that she wished only to be pleasant. Yet beneath that sweetness lay a calculation far colder than any open act of rivalry. Every tilt of her head, every modest glance downward, every moment of stillness allowed her to measure the balance of the household and the weaknesses of the woman who ruled it. To the untrained eye, her gentleness appeared genuine. She seemed careful not to disturb the order of the family. She listened more than she spoke. She offered small compliments with careful timing, each one crafted to soothe the wife's sense of dignity. This performance disarmed suspicion. It allowed her to move unnoticed through private spaces, to watch conversations unfold, to learn what strained the marriage and what soothed it. All the while, she hid her intentions behind that same soft, steady smile. There was a strange power in such restraint. A wife might mistake the softness for humility. She might believe the younger woman wished only to avoid trouble. And in that moment of lowered guard, the mistress slipped deeper into the household's inner workings. She learned how the husband looked at his wife late in the evening, how he sighed when a subject displeased him, and how he softened when met with sympathy. She studied every detail not out of admiration, but out of strategy. The smile was her shield. It allowed her to pass unchallenged, to appear harmless even when she scrutinized everything around her. She could stand beside the wife without provoking fear, could pour wine at the table without raising suspicion. You could sit quietly in the corner while her eyes gathered every detail the room revealed. No one questioned a pleasant face. No one doubted a gentle voice. But what wives rarely understood was that the smile was never meant for them. It was meant for the husband, whose gaze lingered too long, whose pride warmed under such delicate attention. The mistress understood this well. She knew that the smallest sign of softness could grow into something far stronger when placed before a man who craved admiration. Her smile told him he was wise, misunderstood, deserving of comfort. It suggested that she, unlike his wife, saw the world as he saw it. That illusion alone was enough to shift the balance of the household. Every gesture she made carried intention. Subtle, deliberate, cloaked beneath grace. She adjusted her posture to appear open and agreeable. She kept her voice low, so the husband leaned closer. She let silence stretch between sentences, inviting interpretation. encouraging him to fill the gaps with his own desires. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was simple kindness. Everything served a purpose. And yet, from the outside, everything looked peaceful. The wife saw no hostility, no raised voices, no bold attempts to replace her. What she received instead was a portrait of sweetness, a woman who smiled too gently to be dangerous. But sweetness can dull the senses more effectively than cruelty, and a well-crafted smile can build a foundation for something far more destructive than open conflict. There was a quiet cruelty in how she hid her intentions. The mistress never rushed, never pushed, never revealed too much. She let her presence grow gradually, like ivy along a stone wall, unnoticed until the structure beneath began to crack. And through it all, the smile remained, unchanged, soft, reassuring. A mask worn so well that even the wife, who should have recognized danger first, found herself believing in its innocence. A smile, after all, is one of the simplest things a person can offer. But in a Tudor home, where power lived inside small gestures and quiet rooms, the simplest things were often the most dangerous. A mistress needed no threats, no sharp words, no grand schemes. She needed only to let her smile linger a little too long, to let it settle in the husband's mind, to let it unsettle the wife in ways she could not articulate. That was the power she wielded. Quiet, calculated, hidden beneath softness. And so the household shifted. Not with noise, but with gentleness. Chairs were drawn nearer to where the mistress sat. Conversations turned subtly toward her opinions. The wife felt something changing, but could not pinpoint when it began. By the time she sensed the danger beneath that pleasant expression, the smile had already done its work. This quiet unraveling leaves behind an uneasy trace of how easily a household can bend under a single gentle expression. There are moments when warmth becomes a shadow rather than a comfort. And somewhere deeper in the house, another softness is already waiting to be noticed. There were moments inside a Tudor household when the air felt thinner, when a wife's composure slipped under the weight of exhaustion, illness, or quiet disappointment. These were the moments a mistress learned to recognize with an instinct as sharp as any blade. She did not enter loudly. She chose her timing with the precision of someone who understood that emotion. Not opportunity was the true doorway into a family. When the wife faltered, perhaps after a quarrel, perhaps after a sleepless night, perhaps after sensing the growing distance in her husband's eyes, the mistress positioned herself just close enough to be noticed, yet far enough to seem unobtrusive. Her presence filled the spaces the wife no longer could. She cultivated stillness first, allowing the husband to feel her attention without her having to speak. A man burdened by domestic dissatisfaction often looked for understanding before he looked for solutions. She offered that understanding freely, with gentle eyes and a tone softened by careful restraint. She did not question him, nor propose answers. She simply allowed him to believe that she grasped what he felt without needing to ask. It was a silent invitation to lean closer, to lower his guard, to confide in someone who appeared to carry no judgment. Her manner suggested loyalty without pledging it. When the husband spoke of frustrations, she listened with the kind of patience that implied sympathy. If he spoke of his wife's weariness, the mistress showed concern. If he sighed over the burdens of responsibility, she nodded with quiet recognition. She mirrored his emotions with careful moderation. Never more intense than he, never less. This balance created a strange illusion that she stood gently at his side, yet also respected the wife's place. In truth, she stood nowhere and everywhere at once, belonging to no one, yet slipping into the emotional spaces left unattended. The wife, in those moments of vulnerability, rarely noticed the shift. She saw only someone polite, someone who behaved with a softness that made criticism seem petty. The mistress did not threaten her openly. She did not challenge her authority or attempt to replace her voice. She simply offered an alternative, a place where the husband felt temporarily unburdened, a place where his thoughts were heard more tenderly, his discontent received more gently, his pride handled with greater care. What made the mistress dangerous was her ability to appear aligned with both sides. She expressed worry for her wife's fatigue, lamenting how difficult her role must be. She sympathized with the husband's frustrations, acknowledging how misunderstood he must feel. This dual allegiance was an illusion, but a convincing one. It let her slip deeper into the family's emotional rhythm without provoking confrontation. To observers, she seemed harmlessly considerate. To the husband, she seemed understanding. To the wife, she seemed supportive. In truth, she was weaving a web none of them fully recognized. This positioning required patience. She never pushed too far, never assumed a place too openly. Instead, she allowed the husband to approach her in his own time. Guided by her quiet steadiness, he began to share small remarks, small complaints, small hesitations. She received them with a softness that encouraged repetition. Over time, the small things grew larger. He found himself turning to her, not because she offered solutions, but because she offered an atmosphere void of tension, expectation, or judgment. Meanwhile, the wife began to sense a subtle shift. Nothing concrete, nothing she could object to. Only the faint feeling that her emotional hold on her husband was being diluted. His gaze drifted. His patience shortened. His silences lengthened. He spoke less to her and more to himself, as if sorting thoughts meant for someone else. And in the corner of the room, the mistress heard everything without asking for anything. Her presence became a quiet tether that pulled the emotional center of the household slightly away from the wife. It did not snap the bond, it stretched it. And in that stretching, the mistress found exactly the position she needed. Not declared, not defended, not visible enough to accuse, just present enough to matter. This gentle repositioning leaves the room feeling slightly altered, as if warmth has shifted toward a quieter source. It creates a space where comfort grows in directions no one intended. And in that widening silence, something else begins to take root. Unnoticed but persistent, silence inside a Tudor home carried its own weight. Settling into the corners of rooms where secrets tended to gather, a mistress learned quickly that noise revealed little. But quietness, carefully maintained, revealed everything. She understood when to step back, when to dim her presence until she blended with the tapestries and the stone walls, when to let the household forget she was even in the room. Observing from the shadows allowed her to see truths that words often disguised. No one questioned silence. No one guarded themselves against someone who seemed barely there. From her quiet position, she watched how the wife moved through her days. Noting the small cracks in her composure, she paid attention to the moments when the wife sighed more deeply, when her hands trembled slightly, when her voice lost its firmness. These were not dramatic weaknesses, but they were weaknesses all the same. Each one offered a glimpse into the patterns of strain that shaped the household. The mistress stored these details with the care of someone collecting rare and valuable items. A dropped glance here, a forced smile there. Every gesture helped her understand which threads held the family together and which threads were ready to fray. She learned the wife's routines first. When she rose, when she prayed, when she walked the gardens alone too long, when she returned to her room earlier than usual. She noticed what topics unsettled her, what memories softened her, what silences made her retreat inward. None of this required conversation. It required presence without intrusion. The mistress stepped lightly, moving through spaces without calling attention to herself, letting the wife forget she was being watched. Yet her purpose was never simple curiosity. She studied the wife the way one studies a map, seeking paths, vulnerabilities, terrain that could be navigated when the time came. Every habit the wife repeated became a point of reference, and every fear she tried to hide became a quiet advantage. The mistress never acted on this knowledge directly. Acting too soon would break the illusion of innocence she depended on. Instead, she allowed the information to settle, waiting for the right moment to let it shift the balance of the home. Observing the husband required a different approach. With him, she remained visible enough to be noticed, but not enough to seem bold. She let him forget her presence when he was lost in thought, and she watched what softened or hardened his expression. A man unaware of being observed revealed more truth than any confession. She marked the way he reacted to his wife's words, the way his patience thinned, the way his attention wandered. These details mattered, not because she wished to expose them, but because they told her exactly where to position herself when emotional tides changed. The servants, too, offered their own kind of information. They spoke freely when they believed she was simply passing by, or when they thought she was too distant to hear. She learned which servants favoured the wife, which ones resented her, which ones whispered behind closed doors. Servants carried the pulse of a household, and she listened carefully to that pulse without appearing to seek it. Nothing made people careless like believing they were unobserved. Her silence became her most reliable companion. With it, she slipped into moments others overlooked, a half-open door revealing a private argument, a hurried conversation cut short when someone entered the room, a gesture of frustration between husband and wife. She never interrupted, never lingered too long. She collected the fragments and left before anyone realized a witness had been present at all. What made her skill dangerous was not the act of watching, but the ease with which she vanished afterward. The wife rarely sensed that her private struggles had been seen. The husband never suspected that his quiet displeasures had been noted. The household moved as it always did, unaware that someone was quietly gathering their emotional debris and arranging it into something meaningful. From the shadows, the mistress gained a kind of power that required no confrontation. Knowledge, once collected, could be used without announcement. A subtle comment at the right moment, a sympathetic glance at the right time, a silence that hinted at understanding. Each action shaped by what she observed, each one nearly impossible to trace back to her. Influence built slowly under the mask of gentleness. In a home where everyone spoke carefully, the one who mastered quietness held the deepest advantage. She did not need to expose secrets. She needed only to understand them. When the time arrived to tilt the household's balance, she would already know where to apply the slightest pressure. This silent watching leaves a subtle haze over the household, as if unseen eyes have begun to guide its rhythm. It creates an undercurrent no one can name, though everyone eventually feels. Beneath that quiet surface, something patient and deliberate continues to grow. Kindness, when delivered with careful precision, could cut more deeply than outright hostility inside a Tudor home. A mistress understood this with an instinct sharpened by observation. She knew that a gentle remark, placed at the right moment, carried more weight than a direct challenge. A small compliment, spoken with a quiet smile, could shift the air in a room. It could make the husband reconsider his beliefs, or make the wife question herself without ever hearing a word of criticism. Softness could unsettle far more effectively than anger, because it disguised intention beneath a veil of sweetness. Her compliments were rarely grand. They were delicate, almost fragile, crafted to appear harmless. She might praise the wife's patience in a tone that suggests it was forced. She might admire the wife's steadiness in a way that suggested it had begun to slip. These remarks did not accuse, they implied. The wife often felt a faint sting in them, a sudden unease she could not articulate. The husband, however, heard only gentleness. He wondered why such softness seemed absent in his own household. The mistress let that thought bloom naturally, never rushing it, never acknowledging its existence. There was danger in how she delivered her words. She spoke with a measured humility that made any defensive reaction seem unreasonable. If the wife stiffened, the mistress only smiled, as though confused by the tension. If the wife ignored her, she lowered her eyes as if wounded. Her politeness made it impossible to confront her without appearing cruel or insecure. In this way, her gentleness became a shield, one that protected her while subtly wounding the wife who stood before her. The husband, unaware of the currents beneath the surface, felt drawn to this softness. Her voice soothed where his wife's voice strained under the weight of daily responsibilities. Her laughter came lightly, lacking the fatigue that had settled into his marriage. She listened without urging him to change, without reminding him of duties, without challenging his decisions. He compared these qualities unconsciously, letting his mind drift toward what seemed easier, calmer, more pleasant. The mistress did not encourage the comparison aloud. She merely existed as an alternative, polished and patient. What made her approach effective was how naturally it appeared. Her civility blended into the rhythm of the household until no one could distinguish it from genuine kindness. But beneath each polite phrase lay a carefully shaped intention, to shift the husband's perception, to weaken the wife's standing, to build a sense of imbalance too subtle to name. She never raised her voice. She never uttered a harsh word. Yet the space around her grew warmer for the husband and colder for the wife. When tension emerged between husband and wife, the mistress never reacted with triumph. Instead, she looked troubled, concerned, almost apologetic, as if she wished peace for the household while quietly benefiting from its cracks. This performance deepened her influence. It made her appear morally superior, even compassionate. Her sorrowful glances suggested she hoped the couple would reconcile, though her presence ensured they rarely could. Her exaggerated politeness caused further damage. She offered assistance in ways that undermined the wife's authority, smoothing a tablecloth the wife had already arranged, correcting a detail in a story with an innocent tone, and expressing concern for the wife's well-being in front of others. None of these acts were overt challenge, but each one created a moment where the wife appeared less steady, less confident, less in control. The husband noticed these moments, even if he could not explain why they unsettled him. To the outside world, the mistress seemed gracious, considerate, almost admirable. Her courtesy made her appear harmless, and that illusion protected her better than any defense she could have spoken. Everyone praised her sweetness. No one saw its edge. Only the wife sensed the quiet slicing beneath each gentle word, but she struggled to condemn it without sounding paranoid. The mistress had crafted her strategy precisely for this reason. Attacks hidden inside politeness left no wounds visible enough to accuse. Over time, the household began shifting around this gentleness. Conversations bent toward the mistress's presence. Laughter softened when she entered. Judgment eased in her direction. The wife, once the emotional center of the home, felt herself pushed slightly outward, though she could not pinpoint when it began. 1,000 small kindnesses had done the work silently, patiently, thoroughly. This delicate courtesy leaves the home feeling strangely unbalanced, as if sweetness has begun pulling the walls inward. It creates a softness that hides its own sharpness well. With the air shifting this quietly, another layer of intention waits to reveal itself. A mistress in a Tudor household understood that the most effective way to enter a family was to convince everyone she had no intention of entering it at all. She shaped her presence with a quiet modesty, presenting herself as someone without desires, without influence, without a place of her own. Her expression carried the softness of someone who asked for nothing, hoped for little, and posed no threat. This illusion of harmlessness worked more deeply than any lie she could speak aloud. She began by disclaiming ambition. Whenever conversations drifted toward the household's affairs, she stepped back politely, insisting that she knew nothing worth adding. If someone praised her, she shook her head with gentle embarrassment. If someone included her in decisions, she declined with humility. These gestures did not simply protect her from scrutiny. They created a portrait of someone incapable of meddling. The wife saw a young woman too timid to impose herself, too unsure to challenge authority, too grateful merely to be allowed near the edges of the family. To strengthen this perception, the mistress often referred to herself as an outsider. She said it softly, as if apologizing for the inconvenience of her own existence. "I am only a guest," she might murmur. Or, "I am only passing through." These words served as a subtle reassurance. She claimed she did not belong. Therefore, she could not possibly be seeking a place that was not hers. The wife, weary from her own responsibilities, allowed herself to believe this. It was easier than sensing danger everywhere. The mistress's manner reinforced the illusion. She walked lightly through hallways, touched objects delicately, and avoided interrupting conversations. She dressed modestly beside the wife. Never too bright, never too bold, never enough to attract accusation. She appeared as someone who wished only to exist quietly in the background. This softness lowered the wife's guard more effectively than deceit spoken directly. No one suspects a shadow that tries so hard to stay small. Whenever tension arose, the mistress retreated first. She excused herself before arguments began, showing respect that required little from her and soothed the household's unease. Her distance suggested innocence. Observers believed she avoided conflict because she wished for peace, not because she wished to observe it quietly from the doorway. By stepping away at the right moment, she convinced the wife that her presence carried no intention at all. What made her tactic particularly dangerous was how easily others accepted it. The husband saw her humility as sincerity. He believed she held no designs on his affection, which paradoxically made her draw him closer. Without ambition, she seemed purer than the struggles weighing on his marriage. Without demands, she seemed gentler than the expectations placed upon him. He saw her as a quiet refuge, unaware that her restraint was as deliberate as any bold pursuit. The wife, meanwhile, found comfort in this harmless appearance. She saw no reason to treat the mistress with caution. After all, the young woman apologized too often, stepped back too quickly, and yielded too easily. These were not the behaviors of someone who sought influence. They were the behaviors of someone grateful to be tolerated. The wife's confidence, once guarded, began to soften. She shared small personal frustrations in moments of fatigue. She allowed the mistress to assist her with trivial tasks. She spoke freely when she believed the young woman lacked the will to twist her words. Every small confession became a thread the mistress quietly collected. Each moment the wife let down her guard, strengthened the illusion of safety. The household adjusted around this perception until the mistress's presence no longer felt intrusive. It felt routine. She did not need to fight for space. She needed only to avoid appearing to want it. Even her silences served the illusion. When gossip stirred among the servants, she smiled faintly and excused herself. When discussions of marriage, loyalty, or propriety arose, she lowered her gaze as if the topics pained her. Her reluctance to participate made her seem morally unthreatening, almost fragile. Yet fragility, when crafted with intent, can be one of the most powerful disguises. This illusion grew slowly, like mist settling over familiar rooms. The wife relaxed. The husband drifted closer. The servants dismissed her. No one noticed how carefully she curated each gesture, each pause, each faint smile to reinforce the idea that she posed no danger. The household believed what it wished to believe, that a harmless presence required no watchfulness. By the time the truth began to surface, the illusion had already woven itself into the home's foundation. This quiet disguise leaves the household feeling calm, as if gentleness has wrapped itself around every corner. It invites trust where caution once lived. Once trust shifts this easily, something else is free to move into its place. Influence inside a Tudor household rarely shifted through grand gestures. It moved through quiet suggestions that seemed too small to matter. A mistress understood this better than anyone. She knew that a single bold act would expose her intentions, but 100 tiny ones, each insignificant on its own, could reshape the entire balance of a marriage. So she began with the smallest things, offering comments that felt like casual observations rather than proposals. A change in seating at the table, a different order for household tasks, a softer approach to handling the husband's moods. Each remark was framed as a gentle idea, never a directive, always spoken with humility. The wife, overwhelmed by the weight of her responsibilities, sometimes accepted these suggestions simply because they sounded helpful. A small adjustment saved her a bit of time. Another eased a tense moment between her and her husband. She did not realize she was allowing another voice to slip quietly into decisions that had once belonged entirely to her. The mistress never insisted. She merely allowed acceptance to seem like convenience. When the husband noticed the effects of these small changes, a calmer dinner, a smoother morning, a quieter evening, he began attributing these improvements to the mistress. Even when the wife was the one doing the work, her presence became associated with ease. While his wife's presence remained tied to routine struggles, the mistress did not claim credit. She simply smiled softly when the husband looked her way, letting him create his own conclusions. Gradually, the wife's authority began to thin around the edges. A few of her decisions were questioned by her husband, though gently at first. He wondered whether a different arrangement might work better. He wondered whether an alternative approach would feel less strained. Each time he hesitated, the mistress remained quiet, allowing him to believe the idea was his own. The wife sensed the shift but lacked the evidence to confront it. Nothing dramatic had changed. Only the subtle feeling that her voice no longer settled matters as it once had. The mistress's suggestions continued with careful restraint. She avoided topics too large, too visible, too tied to the wife's pride. Instead, she targeted those unguarded corners of the household, which fabrics were chosen for new garments, how the servants prepared meals, when guests should be welcomed or turned away. These choices seemed trivial, but they shaped the rhythm of the home. And slowly, the rhythm began to echo the mistress's preferences rather than the wife's. The husband, meanwhile, started asking her opinion without fully realizing he was doing so. It began as a courtesy. "What do you think?" spoken lightly, as if the answer held no real consequence. But her responses, always measured and respectful, soothed him. She spoke with gentleness rather than frustration, with curiosity rather than certainty. Her voice felt like a safe place for his thoughts to rest. Soon, he turned to her not only for small matters, but for anything that made him feel misunderstood by his wife. The wife noticed these moments with a tightening in her chest. It was not that her husband dismissed her. He simply included another voice where none had belonged before. When she offered her own opinion, it was weighed against the mistress's, and the comparison, though unspoken, hung heavily in the air. Her authority, once unquestioned, now required justification. What made the shift particularly cruel was its invisibility. The mistress never contradicted the wife directly. She never challenged decisions openly. She merely provided alternatives so softly that the husband came to believe he had expanded his perspective rather than replaced his wife's guidance. The wife began doubting herself, unsure whether her own instincts were still valued. Doubt, once planted, grew faster than she expected. In time, the household adjusted to this new order. Servants began glancing subtly toward the mistress before carrying out tasks, gauging her reaction. The husband consulted her on matters he once would have discussed solely with his wife. The mistress did not celebrate these changes. She maintained a posture of humility. insisting she held no authority. Yet power often lives in contradiction, claimed by those who deny it, surrendered by those who do not realize they are losing it. The erosion was not loud. It did not announce itself. It happened the way fabric thins over years of wear, quietly, gradually, until one day the wife found herself unable to ignore the weakening of her own place within her home. The threads holding her authority had loosened, one invisible decision at a time. This slow unraveling casts a faint tremor across the household, as if something once solid has begun to drift. It creates a space where certainty gives way to hesitation. As the quiet shifts deepen, another change is already preparing to take its place. A mistress did not need accusations or bold statements to unravel a wife standing inside a Tudor household. All she needed were small, drifting remarks, frail enough to sound harmless, yet pointed enough to disturb the air around them. These comments floated like dust motes in sunlight, barely visible, seemingly accidental, but capable of unsettling anyone who inhaled them. She understood that a whispered suggestion of imperfection often carried more weight than any direct criticism. Doubt did not require force, it required precision. Her accidental remarks were crafted with careful subtlety. She might sigh softly when the wife entered the room, then smile as if nothing had happened. She might express surprise that the wife looked tired, though she phrased it as concern. Or she might ask whether the wife had meant to speak sharply during a conversation. Even if the wife had spoken plainly, these small threads of suggestion drifted into the husband's mind, tugging gently at his patience. He wondered, quietly at first, whether his wife's tone had changed, whether her confidence masked frustration, whether she had become less attentive to the household. The mistress never repeated herself. Repetition would make her intentions too clear. Instead, she released her comments sparingly, like drops of ink falling slowly into water. Each drop dissolved into the family's routine, subtle but impossible to remove. She knew that the husband, once stirred by these impressions, would begin gathering evidence on his own. A frown from the wife became meaningful. A brief silence became a sign of tension. A misinterpreted gesture became proof of something that had never existed. He believed these thoughts were his own. Though each one began with her quiet remark, the wife felt the effects long before she understood their source. Suddenly, her husband questioned her decisions with a patience that seemed forced. He hesitated before accepting her explanations. His eyes lingered not on what she said, but how she said it. The wife sensed a shift. Something small but persistent, like a draft seeping through a crack in the wall. Her husband's trust had not vanished, but it had thinned in subtle ways she struggled to name. The mistress's power grew through ambiguity. She rarely spoke clearly enough to be confronted. Her remarks were wrapped in gentleness, delivered with an apologetic tilt of the head or a soft lowering of the voice. When confronted, she widened her eyes in confusion and insisted she had meant only kindness. Her innocence, performed with such delicacy, made the wife appear unreasonable if she objected. A wife defending herself against shadows always seemed desperate, while a mistress claiming misunderstanding appeared gracious. Her vague comments toward the wife were only half the strategy. The other half was directed toward the husband, framed as gentle concern. She might say, quietly, "I hope she is not too burdened." Or, "Perhaps she is tired from worry." These lines seemed compassionate on the surface, but they painted a picture of the wife as fragile, overwhelmed, or slipping beneath her duties. The mistress's tone carried no accusation, and that was precisely why the husband believed her sincerity. She spoke softly, with warmth, as though her only desire was harmony in the home. Her subtlety allowed her to erode the wife's image without appearing to sharpen a single edge. Over time, the husband began turning to the mistress for clarity. She listened with a calm understanding that disguised the satisfaction behind her eyes. Her responses always sounded balanced, never favoring herself too obviously. Perhaps she did not mean it that way, she would say gently, inviting the husband to believe he was the one seeing clearly. This delicate reinforcement carved out a space where the mistress became his emotional compass. Her soft reassurances guided him, even as they nudged him further from his wife. The wife, meanwhile, found herself doubting her own footing. She questioned whether her tone had been harsh, whether her expressions had been misunderstood, and whether her fatigue had become too visible. These doubts weakened her confidence, which in turn shaped her behavior. An unsteady wife made the mistress's previous remarks appear more truthful, completing the quiet circle of self-fulfilling impressions. It was a method of erasure performed without noise, without confrontation, only drifting suggestions that settled into the corners of the family's life. Truth held little power in such an environment. Perception, once shifted, carried everything. The mistress understood that the most enduring wounds were inflicted by thoughts that people believed they formed themselves. A single, ambiguous sentence could linger longer than any insult spoken aloud. And in the quiet rooms of a Tudor home, where pride and vulnerability lived side by side, ambiguity was a tool sharper than any blade. This faint manipulation leaves a thin mist over the household, as if meanings have begun to blur in the softest places. It opens small gaps where confidence once stood firm. Through those quiet openings, another influence begins to slip quietly forward. A mistress who wished to secure her place inside a Tudor household understood that appearances mattered more than intentions. She learned to move through the home with a softness that suggested humility, carrying herself as though she felt unworthy of the attention she received. Her posture was modest, her expressions gentle, her tone always lower than the wife's. Before the husband's family, she behaved as though every gesture of kindness toward her was undeserved. This performance shaped the way others saw her, not as a rival, but as a fragile creature in need of guidance, one who lacked the pride or boldness to threaten anyone's position. In rooms filled with gossip and judgment, humility became her shield and her weapon. The parents of the husband, often stern and cautious, softened when they witnessed her attempts to behave with grace. She greeted them with lowered eyes and clasped hands, never daring to speak before being addressed. She agreed quickly, thanked excessively, and withdrew whenever she sensed tension. Her timidity made the wife seem severe by comparison, though the wife had done nothing but maintain the dignity expected of her. The contrast was subtle, but it fed into a quiet narrative. One woman seemed rigid, the other gentle. One commanded authority, the other appeared content to obey. The elders in the family found comfort in the mistress's compliance, unaware of how deliberately it had been shaped. Her kindness extended to the servants as well. She made a point of noticing their struggles, complimenting their work, and offering help with tasks that were never hers to perform. She lifted baskets heavier than her frame suggested she should carry, wiped spills with a laugh, and thanked the kitchen workers as though she were grateful to be included in their world. These actions endeared her to the lower ranks of the household, who rarely received such attention from anyone above them. Servants carried stories through the walls faster than the wind, and soon the household murmured with tales of the sweet young woman who treated everyone kindly. The mistress never needed to repeat these stories herself. The servants spread them freely, believing they were defending someone who finally saw them. The wife, of course, was not unkind, but kindness performed loudly, visibly, repeatedly was easier to admire than kindness, practiced quietly through expectation and duty. The wife instructed servants, corrected mistakes, and enforced discipline when needed. Her actions kept the household functioning, yet they made her seem cold beside the mistress's warmth. The contrast deepened each time. The mistress bent to pick up something. The servants dropped or smiled patiently during a scolding that was never meant for her. The household saw a woman who made their lives easier, and a wife who made their lives orderly. Predictably, affection leaned toward ease rather than order. When gatherings were held, the mistress ensured her sweetness reached every corner. She poured wine with a steady hand, complimented guests sincerely, and stepped into the background before anyone could accuse her of drawing attention. She laughed at jokes meant for others, offered help before being asked, and apologized if she merely bumped someone's sleeve. Her restraint made her appear thoughtful and gentle. She was the girl who attempted to cause no inconvenience, who blushed easily, who seemed surprised whenever someone praised her. People liked her instinctively because she behaved in a way that made them feel generous. The wife watched these performances with growing unease. She knew kindness could not be commanded or accused, and she had no grounds to object. Every action the mistress took appeared harmless, even admirable. Yet she sensed the quiet shift in the way people looked at her husband's household. Their eyes softened when they saw the mistress, and hardened slightly when they turned to her. No one spoke this change aloud, but the shift lived in small glances, in softened tones. In the subtle ways people lingered near the mistress, as though her presence brought comfort. What made the mistress's performance so effective was that she never overplayed it. She knew when to withdraw, when to accept praise modestly, and when to appear embarrassed by attention. She acted like someone who wanted nothing except peace inside a home that did not belong to her. And because she appeared harmless, people allowed her deeper into their affection. They believed they were protecting someone delicate, someone grateful, someone good. They did not realize they were giving her something far more valuable than sympathy. Influence built through admiration. Her goodness became a mask no one questioned. The wife alone felt something wrong beneath the softness, but every attempt to articulate it sounded petty. How could she criticize kindness? How could she mistrust humility? In a home where reputations lived and died through perception, the mistress played her role so convincingly that even doubts seemed uncharitable. By the time the household embraced her fully, the performance no longer required effort. The illusion had solidified into belief. This careful sweetness leaves the household wrapped in a gentle haze, as if goodness itself has taken shape in human form. It draws warmth toward a presence that never claims it. As that warmth deepens, another layer of intention begins quietly forming beneath it. There were moments inside a Tudor household when a whisper carried more weight than any spoken declaration. A mistress understood that people guarded themselves against loud accusations, but rarely defended their hearts from words delivered softly, as if meant only to comfort. She mastered the art of lowering her voice until her sentences brushed against the husband's ear like a blessing. Yet beneath that gentle cadence, each phrase carried a seed of doubt, crafted with meticulous care. A whisper, when shaped correctly, could turn the direction of a marriage without leaving a single trace behind. She never approached these moments hurriedly. She waited for evenings when the husband appeared unsettled, when a long sigh lingered between words, or when he seemed absorbed in thoughts too heavy to name. In those moments, she leaned slightly nearer, as though offering solace, and let a quiet remark slip from her lips. "I hope she is well," she might murmur. Or, "Perhaps something troubles her more than she wishes to admit." These comments sounded gentle, even sympathetic. Yet they nudged the husband toward conclusions he believed he reached alone. Her strategy depended on ambiguity. She avoided direct criticism, knowing that clarity exposed intention. Instead, she relied on hints that circled the edge of meaning. "She seemed tired today," she whispered, even if the wife had simply been quiet. Or, "I fear she holds burdens she does not speak of," planting an image of fragility where there was none. The remark ended there, leaving enough space for the husband's imagination to finish the work. A whisper demanded interpretation, and interpretation allowed doubt to take form. In time, the husband began watching his wife differently. He noticed her pauses, her sighs, her expressions at the end of long days. These details, once mundane, suddenly appeared as potential signs of unrest. He questioned her moods, her habits, her methods of handling the household. He believed he was becoming more attentive, unaware that the shift began with the mistress's quiet suggestions. His changed perception felt natural to him. Whispers carry a power precisely because they disguise their origin. The wife sensed the tension before she understood it. She felt her husband studying her with an unease that had not existed before. His questions appeared gentle but carried a sharp edge. When she offered explanations, he seemed unconvinced. When she showed confidence, he interpreted it as stubbornness. The wife could not name the source of this new scrutiny, yet it pressed against her like a faint, persistent weight. She felt as though someone had turned the light slightly away from her, though she did not know who held the flame. Meanwhile, the mistress continued her work with quiet discipline. She offered new whispers sparingly, never enough to arouse suspicion. A single phrase this week, another next month. Each one a delicate adjustment to the narrative forming in the husband's mind. Her voice trembled slightly when speaking of the wife, as though she feared saying too much. This trembling was intentional. It gave her whispers the appearance of honesty. The husband mistook her caution for virtue, believing she wished only for the household's harmony. She knew that doubt, once planted, expanded with the slightest encouragement. When the husband shared his concerns, she met his words with sorrowful eyes and a small sigh. "I am certain she means well," she would murmur, allowing her tone to suggest she feared otherwise. The husband, hearing only gentleness, mistook her hesitation for empathy. He trusted her interpretation because it felt calmer than his own. He believed she saw clearly, unaware that she had dimmed his vision the moment she first spoke softly into his ear. The wife's standing eroded quietly. Her confidence faltered each time her husband questioned her decisions. She wondered whether she had spoken too sharply, whether fatigue had clouded her judgment, whether she had somehow failed him without realizing it. This self-doubt confirmed the impressions the husband already carried, deepening his belief in the mistress's whispered concerns. A cycle formed, one that neither the husband nor the wife understood. Yet both moved within, as though guided by unseen hands. Servants observed the change, but misinterpreted its cause. They assumed the wife had grown temperamental, or that the husband had become distant. None of them suspected that the mistress's soft words had threaded themselves through the walls of the home, altering its emotional architecture. The mistress kept her distance during these moments, watching the effects of her whispers settle like dust over the household. Her influence, invisible yet pervasive, thrived precisely because it appeared harmless. A whisper delivered in kindness does not sound like manipulation. It sounds like concern. It sounds like care. And in the delicate rooms of Tudor life, where honor and reputation held immense weight, such sweetness could move the world more effectively than any confrontation. This gentle murmur leaves the household shifting in ways no one can quite describe. As if meanings have blurred beneath the softest breath, it opens faint spaces where certainty once lived. Within those spaces, another influence begins its quiet approach. Inside a Tudor household, a mistress who wished to deepen her influence learned quickly that the surest path toward a man's affection was not boldness, but reflection. She discovered that mirroring his emotions, subtly, carefully, created the illusion of perfect understanding. When he appeared, troubled, her face softened with worry. When he felt triumphant, her eyes brightened as though sharing in his victory. She adjusted her expression, her breath, even the rhythm of her silence to match the unspoken tone of his thoughts. This quiet alignment invited him into a space where he felt recognized in ways he did not feel with his wife, whose responsibilities often drew her attention elsewhere. The power of this reflection lay in its effortlessness. The mistress rarely spoke first. She waited for the husband to reveal a fragment of his mood, A sigh, a slight change in posture, a distant look, and then shaped her presence to complement it. If he seemed burdened, her voice softened with concern. If he appeared restless, she matched the energy with a gentle tension in her own movements. Nothing was exaggerated. Precision mattered more than intensity. He concluded, without realizing it, that she understood him instinctively. The wife did not lack devotion, but devotion expressed through duty rarely carried the same emotional warmth. Her days were filled with decisions, expectations, and responsibilities that demanded strength rather than softness. When her husband showed signs of strain, she responded with practicality, offering solutions instead of sympathy. She addressed the cause rather than the feeling. It was not neglect, it was simply the nature of her role. Yet this difference in approach created an opening the mistress stepped into with quiet grace. The husband felt this difference deeply. With the mistress, he experienced a kind of emotional ease that required nothing from him. Not explanations, not effort, not resilience. Her responses flowed gently, never correcting, never challenging, never pressing him to act. He felt seen rather than managed, understood rather than evaluated. His guard lowered more quickly in her presence than he ever intended. He spoke freely of disappointments, frustrations, and doubts he had never voiced aloud. She listened, not because she cared for the content, but because the act of listening itself bound him closer to her. Her reflections were not always verbal. Often, they lived in small gestures, a subtle tilt of the head when he hesitated, a faint sigh when he felt defeated, a soft smile when he regained confidence. She allowed him to believe that his emotions flowed through her without resistance. The illusion of shared feeling was more potent than any declaration of affection. He began to regard her as someone who existed on the same emotional wavelength, someone who anticipated his thoughts before he formed them. This growing alignment pushed the wife further from his inner world. He did not intend to distance himself, but comparison crept in quietly. When his wife questioned his decisions, he saw criticism where none had been meant. When she offered guidance, he felt misunderstood. Her strength, which had once anchored him, now seemed rigid beside the mistress's supple presence. He began attributing his wife's firmness to a lack of understanding, rather than to the weight she carried. He forgot that her role demanded stability, not indulgence. The mistress fueled this shift without ever acknowledging it openly. She responded to the husband's complaints with sorrowful eyes, never contradicting him, never reminding him of the wife's burdens. She made space for his grievances, allowing them to grow unchecked. When he confided in her, she whispered, assurances that suggested she alone recognized his troubles. He mistook this performance for emotional intimacy. The more he relied on her, the more he drifted from the wife who had shared his life. Servants noticed the change before the wife herself did. They observed how the husband turned toward the mistress with subtle yearning, as though seeking confirmation of feelings he did not dare express. They saw the way he lingered near her, waiting for the soft gaze that told him he was not alone. Whispers circulated through the hallways, though none dared speak openly. Everyone sensed the shifting loyalty, even as the wife continued her duties, unaware of how deeply the emotional current had tilted. When the wife finally sensed the distance, it arrived as a quiet ache. She noticed the husband's hesitation when she entered the room, the way he withheld certain thoughts, the softness he reserved for someone else. She struggled to understand what had changed. She had not withdrawn affection, nor failed in her obligations. Yet something intangible had slipped away. A closeness once assumed, now fading. The mistress watched this unraveling with concealed satisfaction. Her reflection of the husband's emotions had not merely aligned her with him, it had reshaped his perception of everyone else. In mirroring him, she allowed him to fall in love with the echo of his own feelings. And few attachments were stronger than the ones people mistook for deep understanding. This quiet mirroring leaves the household tilting gently toward a new center, as if the heart of the home has shifted without announcing its move. It creates a faint ache where certainty used to rest. Through that ache, another influence begins edging closer to its target. Inside a Tudor household, reputation lived not in grand events, but in the quiet accumulation of everyday impressions. A mistress who understood this learned to alter the wife's image not through accusation, but through small comments slipped gently into ordinary conversations. These remarks seemed harmless, sometimes even affectionate, yet they carried the subtle weight of redefinition. Each one nudged those listening toward a slightly different understanding of the wife, gradually reshaping how she was seen without anyone realizing the shift had begun. The mistress began with observations spoken as though by accident. "She wakes very early," she might say, with a concerned tilt of her head, as if hinting at exhaustion. Or, "She locks herself away with her thoughts," implying worry rather than simple solitude. None of these statements was untrue. They were merely framed in ways that suggested fragility instead of routine. People accepted them easily. A soft comment rarely provoked suspicion, especially when delivered by someone who appeared incapable of malice. Over time, these remarks grew slightly more pointed, though never overt. The mistress might note that the wife seemed distracted during meals, or that her smile had grown tight around the edges. She phrased these statements gently, never as criticism, always as concern. The tone mattered more than the words. Her softness made it seem as though she cared deeply for the wife's well-being, even as she planted the idea that something in the wife had begun to unravel. Those who heard her whispered reflections carried them forward, repeating them in their own tone, reshaping them further with each retelling. The husband absorbed these impressions most strongly. He began noticing behaviors he had once overlooked. The way his wife rubbed her temples after long hours, the sharpness of her voice when she was tired, the moments she stood alone in the garden as though sorting through something heavy. These were ordinary signs of a woman managing a household, yet under the influence of the mistress's murmurs, they appeared as warning signs. He saw worry where there was concentration, instability where there was fatigue, a coldness where there was simply restraint. The mistress reinforced these perceptions by offering gentle interpretations whenever the husband voiced confusion. "Perhaps she carries more than she lets on," she whispered, creating the suggestion that the wife hid emotional strain. Or, "I hope she isn't losing herself in these burdens," implying weakness the husband had never before imagined. She delivered these lines delicately, with eyes lowered, as if afraid to speak too boldly. Her reluctance made the husband believe she spoke only out of compassion. In this way, the mistress positioned herself as someone who understood the wife better than the wife understood herself. She claimed no authority. She merely offered insights shaped from observation. But those insights, framed as empathy, allowed her to take control of the narrative surrounding the wife. People sought her perspective because she seemed gentle, reasonable, and perceptive. She never spoke harshly, never cast blame, never described the wife's behavior as flawed. Instead, she used the language of care, which made her misdirection all the more persuasive. The wife felt the effects without grasping their cause. She sensed people watching her more closely, searching her face for signs of strain she had not shown. Servants hesitated before asking her questions, as though expecting volatile reactions. The husband asked whether she was unwell even on her most composed days. His concern felt misplaced, almost intrusive, but she could not explain why it unsettled her so deeply. She felt as though her reflection had been altered without her consent, and that others were seeing a version of her she did not recognize. What made the mistress's work especially insidious was its invisibility. She never lied outright. She never accused the wife of failing, never suggested instability directly. She merely allowed ordinary moments to take on darker meanings. By the time the wife realized her reputation had subtly changed, the shift had already settled into the minds of those around her. Reversing it would require confrontation. And confrontation would only confirm the story the mistress had woven, that the wife was becoming tense, overly defensive, or emotionally fragile. The mistress, meanwhile, maintained her gentle demeanor. She offered sympathetic smiles, steadied her voice with practiced softness, and insisted she wished only for harmony in the household. Her performance granted her the moral high ground while isolating the wife within her own home. She had rewritten the wife's image using nothing but half phrases, delicate tones, and a mask of benevolence. Reputation, once shifted subtly, rarely returned to its original form. This quiet reframing leaves the household viewing familiar actions through unfamiliar eyes, as if a soft haze has settled over every impression. It creates a distance between truth and perception wide enough for doubt to root itself. Through that widening space, another influence begins to move more freely. Within the shifting rhythms of a Tudor household, the mistress learned the value of presence. Specifically, a presence so fluid that no one could trace its intention. She appeared at the edges of conversations, in doorways just as decisions were being made, or in hallways when tempers had begun to fray. Her timing never felt deliberate, yet it carried an uncanny precision. She was there when the husband needed reassurance, absent when the wife sought solitude, and quietly nearby whenever matters of importance unfolded. People grew accustomed to seeing her, though no one could say why her presence always seemed so well placed. Her greatest skill was moderation. She never inserted herself too quickly, nor retreated too fully. Instead, she held a delicate distance that suggested both innocence and attentiveness. When visitors arrived, she stood far enough away to avoid appearing intrusive, yet near enough to be noticed. When the family discussed private affairs, she lingered at the periphery, head bowed respectfully, giving the impression she had overheard nothing, even though she absorbed every word with practiced control. Her entire existence within the household balanced on this thin boundary, close, but not too close, distant, but not absent. The husband interpreted this restraint as humility. He admired her ability to step back while still being part of the moment, believing it revealed sensitivity rather than strategy. Her presence soothed him because it required nothing from him. No explanations, no decisions, no responsibility. She shifted into his path with gentle ease, allowing him to believe that her appearances were the product of chance rather than design. Each time she materialized at the right moment, he felt a small, quiet comfort, as if the universe itself had arranged for her to be there. The wife, on the other hand, sensed something she could not articulate. She noticed the mistress's shadow in the background of significant moments, standing by the staircase during tense discussions, pausing in the courtyard when disagreements simmered, or passing through the corridor just as sensitive information was exchanged. The mistress never violated decorum, never stood near enough to provoke reprimand, yet her presence felt intentional, like a faint draft that could not be traced to any window. The wife could not accuse her without sounding irrational, and this inability to speak only deepened her discomfort. Servants observed these patterns as well. They saw the mistress before they heard her, gliding in and out of rooms with a quietness that bordered on spectral. She carried no authority, yet the servants modified their behaviors when she was near, unsure whether she represented the husband's preferences or an unspoken shift in household power. She was not part of the staff, yet she treated them with gentle courtesy. She was not part of the family, yet she moved with an ease that suggested familiarity. Her role existed somewhere between those two worlds, undefined but acknowledged, like a thread woven into fabric without belonging to any pattern. Over time, her constant yet distant presence became part of the house's daily life. People no longer questioned why she appeared where she did. Her figure in the background felt routine, even comforting to some. This normalization worked in her favor. The more frequently people saw her, the less they noticed her. The less they noticed her, the easier it became for her to listen, observe, and understand the emotional currents running through the home. She became an unspoken witness to everything that mattered, while claiming no involvement at all. The husband began relying on her presence without realizing it. He turned toward her in moments of uncertainty, expecting to find her nearby. When she wasn't there, he noticed the absence more than he had ever consciously noticed her presence. This quiet dependency strengthened her position, though she never announced herself as essential. She simply continued appearing, softly, gently, precisely when required, as though drawn by instinct rather than calculation. The wife felt increasingly displaced. Though nothing concrete had changed, the mistress had not made a bold move, nor challenged her openly. Yet the wife sensed her own centrality slipping. She no longer felt like the person around whom the home revolved. Instead, the household seemed to shift around an unnamed gravitational pull, one that followed the mistress's silent footsteps. It was not dominance. It was a kind of quiet orbiting, subtle enough to evade accusation, but powerful enough to unsettle anyone perceptive. The mistress cultivated this ambiguity carefully. She never aligned herself fully with any group, yet she touched them all lightly enough to seem connected. She belonged everywhere and nowhere, holding a presence that could not be confronted because it left no sharp edges to grasp. Her role remained undefined by design. Definitions could be challenged, but vagueness could not. In the end, her presence became a habit the household could not explain, but had grown accustomed to accepting. This drifting presence leaves the home feeling slightly off balance, as if a quiet figure has begun shaping its movements without stepping forward. It creates a familiarity too soft to question, yet too persistent to ignore. In that softened blur, another intention prepares to take root. In a Tudor household, where alliances held as much weight as affection, a mistress understood that gifts, small, thoughtful, carefully placed, could shape the loyalties surrounding her more effectively than bold declarations. She began not with extravagance, but with modest offerings that appeared spontaneous. A sprig of herbs for the mother-in-law's aching joints, a length of ribbon chosen in a shade she claimed reminded her of the sister-in-law's eyes. These gestures seemed gentle, even sweet, and their modesty rendered them impossible to refuse. Each gift created a thread of connection, subtle yet durable, weaving her slowly into the fabric of the family without ever announcing her presence. To the husband's relatives, these gifts suggested attentiveness. She seemed to know precisely what each person needed, even when their own household had overlooked those details. A small jar of salve for the brother's calloused hands whispered of empathy. A preserved treat brought from her own kin hinted at warmth and shared history. She attached no expectations, made no demands, and claimed no special place. She simply offered tokens that felt personal. Soon, family members began speaking of her with softened tones, praising her thoughtfulness as though it reflected an essential goodness rather than carefully measured calculation. Servants felt her influence even more acutely. She gifted them small items, things that seemed insignificant but carried emotional weight. A pair of gloves for a maid whose hands cracked in the winter, a hair ribbon for a young scullery girl who had never worn anything so fine, a pastry given as though she had simply taken too many. These gestures did not elevate her status. They elevated their sense of gratitude. And gratitude, in a household where servants controlled the quiet flow of information, became a powerful form of leverage. She never asked for favors directly. Instead, she built a sense of indebtedness so gentle that no one realized they had accepted it. A servant who received a small kindness might rush to warn her of an upcoming moment of tension, Another might reveal the wife's recent frustrations without intending to betray her. A third might offer insights into the husband's changing moods. The gifts were not bribes, they were emotional footholds, and each one helped refine the mistress's understanding of the household. The grievances, the rhythms, the fractures that could be widened with careful pressure. But the most delicate gifts were reserved for the wife. She always chose them with exaggerated humility, as though she feared overstepping. A handkerchief embroidered clumsily, to imply she had crafted it herself. A small pot of scented balm, presented with the explanation that she happened upon it and thought it might be pleasant. A simple silver pin, offered only after insisting it was far too plain for a lady of such stature. Each gift placed the wife in a complicated position. Declining would seem cold. Accepting required her to display gratitude toward the very woman who unsettled the foundations of her marriage. The wife felt this trap keenly. The gifts forced her into performances of politeness she no longer wished to maintain. When she thanked the mistress, others noticed her gracious tone and interpreted it as harmony. When she accepted something small, observers assumed goodwill existed between them. When she offered nothing in return, she appeared aloof. The gifts reshaped the narrative, the mistress as gentle and giving, the wife as rigid and unresponsive. All this occurred without a single word spoken in self-defense. Meanwhile, the husband saw these offerings as signs of humility. He admired what he viewed as the mistress's desire to contribute to the household without making demands. Each gift softened his perception of her further, allowing him to imagine her as someone who sought peace rather than influence. The wife's discomfort, when visible at all, he interpreted as unnecessary tension rather than a reasonable reaction to manipulation. The mistress positioned each gift like a stepping stone. None were grand enough to attract suspicion. Yet together they created a path that led her deeper into the household's emotional structure. She had no authority, yet she became essential. She owned nothing, yet she shaped everything. The tranquility she projected hid a quiet strategy, generosity as a means of infiltration. Even as the wife attempted to reclaim control, she found herself countered not by force but by kindness. When she tightened boundaries, the mistress responded with another thoughtful offering. When she tried to expose the subtle encroachment, others dismissed it. After all, how could small kindnesses be dangerous? The wife realized, too late, that she was being outmaneuvered not through confrontation, but through the gentle persistence of gifts that made her appear unreasonable simply for questioning them. In the end, the mistress stood at the center of a growing web of softened loyalties, crafted with ribbons, nerps, sweets, and carefully chosen trinkets. These objects, though simple, carried an invisible weight that altered the balance of the household. This quiet generosity leaves the home leaning subtly toward its giver, as if kindness itself has begun rearranging loyalties. It creates a warmth too polished to question, yet too strategic to ignore. Within that glow, another shift prepares to unfold. In a Tudor home, shaped by protocol and appearances, a mistress learned that the truest power did not come from defiance, but from excessive courtesy. Every gesture she offered shimmered with politeness, so refined that it left no room for objection. Her tone remained soft, her posture modest, and her words dipped in sweetness. Anyone watching her would struggle to accuse her of wrongdoing, for nothing she did violated decorum. Instead, she pressed gently against the boundaries of the household, slipping past them under the cover of her own immaculate manners. She addressed the wife with formal respect, always using titles rather than names, always lowering her gaze at the right moment. This exaggerated reverence created a strange tension. If the wife attempted to set firmer limits, the response appeared unnecessarily harsh, in contrast to the mistress's gentle deference. If she remained silent, the mistress crept closer, figuratively and sometimes literally, into spaces once reserved for the lady of the house. A seating arrangement here, a decision offered there, a soft suggestion posed as admiration. Each move coated in courtesy, each step impossible to challenge without seeming petty. The husband rarely recognized this shift. He saw only a woman who carried herself with calm humility, someone who brought harmony rather than disruption. Her polite attentiveness soothed him, softening the edges of daily conflict. When she offered gentle remarks in conversation, he interpreted them as thoughtful. When she deferred to her wife, he mistook it for respect. He did not see how her politeness hollowed out the wife's authority, replacing it with a quieter, the subtler presence standing just behind his shoulder. The mistress's politeness was not for him alone. She wielded it with equal precision toward the household servants. She spoke to them with warmth, seldom extended by those of higher standing, a sincerity that seemed effortless but served a purpose. Servants, flattered by her gentle tone, responded in kind. They offered her assistance quickly, answered her questions freely, and shared household details she should never have known. Her kindness cracked open the guarded spaces where truths, grievances, and whispered frustrations lived. She never asked directly. She made them want to tell her. Toward guests, her courtesy bordered on immaculate. She listened with perfect attention, praised their remarks with measured admiration, and laughed softly at their stories. In these moments, she stole the attention that once belonged to the wife. Though she did so without overshadowing her overtly, it became easy for guests to confuse refinement with virtue. Assuming her gentleness revealed a generous spirit rather than a tactical one. Praise for the mistress grew quietly among them, drifting inevitably toward the ears of the husband, who felt validated in his fondness for her. Meanwhile, the wife found herself cornered by this sweetness. If she attempted to highlight the mistress's encroachment, she risked appearing jealous, bitter, or insecure. If she remained silent, she allowed the slow erosion of her authority. Every courteous gesture from the mistress became a blade sharpened by expectation. The wife could not push back without cutting herself. A reprimand would seem disproportionate. A correction would seem unkind. Even a faint expression of discomfort could be interpreted as hostility. The mistress understood this dynamic intimately. She walked with measured grace, spoke with soft clarity, and ensured every action cast her as the embodiment of composure. Her voice never rose. Her steps never hurried. Her expressions never revealed more than a gentle concern. Through this controlled performance, she crafted an image so delicate that any challenge to it felt like a violation of propriety. Her politeness also reshaped the atmosphere of the house. When she entered a room, conversations softened, tensions eased, and eyes turned toward her, not out of admiration alone, but out of the strange calm she brought. She appeared to soothe conflict, though she often arrived after encouraging its quiet growth. She comforted those she had subtly unsettled, offered sympathy for problems she had helped create, and played the role of peacemaker with unsettling skill. Gradually, she positioned herself as the standard of refinement against which the wife was unconsciously compared. Where the mistress was gentle, the wife appeared rigid. Where the mistress was patient, the wife seemed strained. Where the mistress was soft-spoken, the wife sounded sharp simply for stating her needs. This contrast did not arise by coincidence. It was crafted. Courtesy, when weaponized, could sway perception more deeply than confrontation. The wife began noticing her own diminishing influence. Rooms fell quieter when she spoke. Decisions required more effort to assert. People hesitated under her direction, as though unsure whether her authority still carried weight. The mistress's relentless politeness blurred the wife's position until it felt as though she stood on shifting ground, solid only where others permitted it. Even those who suspected the mistress's intentions found themselves disarmed by her composure. It was difficult to distrust someone who never faltered, never snapped, never showed anything but serene benevolence. Suspicion seemed ungenerous. Doubt felt unjustified. Such is the power of courtesy when wielded by someone who understands that refinement can cloak ambition more effectively than silence ever could. This polished sweetness leaves the household drifting toward a quieter imbalance, as if gentleness itself has begun to push someone aside. It creates a surface so smooth that no resistance can take hold. Inside that surface, calm. Another intention waits to press further. Inside a Tudor household, power rarely shifted in the open. It moved instead through narrow passageways, whispered conversations, and the steady hands of those who served quietly from dawn until the last candle dimmed. A mistress who wished to secure her place understood this better than anyone. She knew the servants formed the nervous system of the home, the unseen chain through which information flowed, tangled, and reshaped itself long before reaching the family. To win the husband, she first had to win them. Her approach was never grand. She began with gestures so small they seemed almost accidental. A question about a maid's sick mother, a warm comment about the cook's bread, the offer of a discarded ribbon to a scullery girl who had never owned anything fine. These moments cost her nothing, yet they left impressions that lingered. Servants, accustomed to sharp commands and distant authority, responded readily to such attention. They softened toward her without realizing it, allowing fragments of loyalty to shift and reform. She took careful note of each servant's routines. Who carried the news fastest? Who listened more than they spoke? Who held grudges? Who sought approval? Understanding these patterns allowed her to place herself gently in their path, creating interactions that felt spontaneous, but were not. She never pried directly. Instead, she let people reveal themselves through their eagerness to please, their frustration with household tensions, or their relief at being acknowledged. She gave them what they rarely received, the feeling of being seen. Soon, servants began volunteering information in subtle ways. A maid mentioned the wife's recent sleepless nights. A footman noted the husband's growing impatience. A kitchen girl whispered that the wife had snapped at the steward. None of these details was important alone, but gathered together, they formed a map of the household's vulnerabilities. The mistress listened with patience, storing each piece with the precision of someone building a calculated understanding of the ground beneath her feet. She offered nothing in return besides gentleness. But that gentleness was its own currency. It encouraged confession without prompting. Servants sought her out to share things they should not have known, as though her presence eased the burden of secrecy. She repeated none of it aloud. Her silence became another layer of trust. In a home where information was exchanged like coins, her discretion marked her as someone safe, a rare quality that drew people closer without realizing they had stepped beyond their own boundaries. Gradually, she learned to guide the flow of information rather than simply receive it. If she murmured a soft observation about the husband's fatigue, that comment drifted through the house until someone repeated it to the wife with unnecessary emphasis. If she sighed that she hoped the wife was not overwhelmed, the remark made its way to the husband, framed as concern from someone who noticed what others ignored. These remarks were never accusations, only gentle worries. But even gentle worries, once repeated enough times, began to alter perception. Servants became unintentional messengers. Their words carried her influence long after she left the room. A stable boy mentioned her kindness in tending to an injured animal. A lady's maid described her as modest and thoughtful. A cook remarked that she never raised her voice, unlike others he had served. These impressions seeped into the household like slow ink, staining its dynamics without visible force. The wife sensed the change long before she understood it. Instructions she gave, the servants were carried out with a trace of hesitance. Questions were met with an undercurrent of pity. as though she was struggling with something fragile yet unnamed. She felt watched, not with suspicion, but with quiet appraisal. Someone else had softened the ground beneath her authority, making every command feel heavier than it once did. The husband, too, was influenced by the currents drifting through the house. When multiple servants praised the mistress's gentleness, he assumed the sentiment reflected genuine appreciation. When they mentioned her thoughtful nature, he saw confirmation of what he already felt. Each repeated remark shaped his view with subtle reinforcement, making the mistress's presence seem natural, even necessary. The mistress herself continued moving with calm restraint. She asked for nothing. She claimed nothing. She simply existed in a way that made people want to support her. Servants stepped aside for her with instinctive deference. They answered her soft questions with more detail than they intended. They repeated her worries as their own. The household began shifting around her presence, adjusting itself slowly, quietly, until she occupied a place no one had acknowledged. But everyone accommodated. Her victory over the servants was not loud or conspicuous. It happened in glances, gestures, and murmured phrases carried through hallways. By the time the wife realized she was losing control of the home's informational pulse, it had already slipped from her grasp. A mistress who controlled the flow of truth controlled far more than rumors. She controlled perception. And once perception changed, the rest of the household followed. This quiet alignment leaves the home drifting toward a new center of trust, as if small kindnesses have begun redirecting the truth itself. It creates a loyalty too soft to challenge, yet too deep to reverse. In that shifting loyalty, another layer of influence waits to unfold. Within the shifting walls of a Tudor household, truth rarely remained untouched. It stretched, softened, and bent beneath the weight of retellings, shaped not by accuracy, but by intention. A mistress who understood this subtle terrain learned that she never needed to accuse, expose, or confront. She only needed to redirect the story, quietly, gently, with the kind of care that made her version feel more natural than the truth itself. Through this muted reshaping, she guided the household toward new interpretations without anyone recognizing her hand. She began with situations so trivial they attracted no suspicion. A slight disagreement between the couple became, in her retelling, a moment when the husband was simply misunderstood. A delayed task became evidence that the wife might be overwhelmed. She chose her words with delicate intention, adding a pause here, a worried glance there, injecting meaning into spaces where none had existed. Her stories were not lies, they were rearranged truths, softened and curved into shapes that benefited her. Her strategy deepened when she blended fact with suggestion. She rarely stated conclusions outright. Instead, she left them resting quietly between sentences. She seemed very quiet today, she would murmur, her tone low, as though protecting the wife from judgment. The silence that followed encouraged listeners to fill in their own assumptions. When someone pressed for more, she responded with gentle reluctance. "I'm certain she's only tired, though I worry she's carrying something alone." These small hesitations gave weight to her implications. They made people believe they were discovering concerns themselves, rather than being led toward them. This technique protected her from accusation. Anyone could challenge a claim. But how could one refute a tone? How could the wife deny being a little tense when others had already been primed to interpret her firmness as strain? The mistress did not attack the wife's character. She subtly rewrote the emotional context in which the wife existed. Even the wife's most ordinary moments, her concentration, her silence, her attempts at composure, became evidence of hidden distress once filtered through the mistress's crafted narrative. Servants contributed unknowingly to this unfolding story. They repeated her soft remarks without malice, carrying her interpretations down hallways and into quiet corners. "She's been very tired lately," a maid whispered. She snapped at the steward again. Another noted. These statements, though mild, accumulated until the household perceived the wife as unstable or secretive. The mistress watched this spread with serene detachment, never correcting the servants, never adding more than a carefully placed sigh to guide them. The husband absorbed these stories most strongly when servants echoed the mistress's sentiments. He heard confirmation rather than coincidence. When she expressed concern for the wife's well-being, he interpreted it as compassion rather than positioning. He noticed behaviors he had once overlooked, her distracted moments, her clipped answers, her private thoughts, and connected them to the narrative already forming around her. The mistress's quiet framing shaped his perception without ever appearing to influence it. The wife felt this shift before she understood it. Her husband's questions carried notes of doubt. Servants regarded her with hesitance, as though expecting something brittle beneath her composure. Conversations dimmed when she entered the room. She sensed the story of her life being rewritten somewhere out of reach. Yet every attempt to correct it only fed the narrative further. If she defended herself too firmly, she seemed tense. If she remained silent, she seemed withdrawn. If she questioned the mistress's intentions, she appeared jealous. The mistress had planned for this. She knew that once the household accepted her version of events, the truth would struggle to reclaim its place. Her influence did not rely on bold statements, but on gentle, persistent shaping. By the time anyone noticed the shift, the narrative had already sunk into their understanding of the household. She had positioned herself as the quiet observer, the patient interpreter of tensions others overlooked. Her voice became the lens through which the family viewed the wife's actions. This was the quiet genius of her approach. She never became the center of the story. Instead, she became its narrator, and the narrator, even without speaking loudly, holds more power than any character within the tale. This muted storytelling leaves the home gently tilting toward a single viewpoint, as if one quiet voice has begun defining the contours of truth. It creates a distance between what happened and what is believed, too subtle to challenge, yet too persistent to ignore. From that distance, another intention slides into place. Within a Tudor household shaped by duty and expectation, a man often sought refuge wherever he felt understood rather than judged. A mistress who recognized this longing learned to slip gently into the spaces his wife could no longer occupy. Not through confrontation, but through listening. She offered no solutions, no criticism, no reminders of responsibility. Instead, she provided the quiet relief of being heard, a luxury that grew more intoxicating each time the weight of the household pressed against him. Her presence became a soft interruption in his day. When he entered a room with tension in his shoulders, she glanced up with a concern so subtle it felt instinctive rather than rehearsed. If he sighed, she allowed silence to settle before offering a gentle acknowledgement. "It seems today has been heavy." The words were simple, but they soothed him more than he realized. She framed his feelings, not his failures, creating a space where his burdens were treated with tender gravity rather than practicality. The wife, meanwhile, he approached tension with the steadiness expected of her position. Her responsibilities demanded firmness, clarity, and resilience, qualities that often left little room for softness. When conflicts arose, she addressed them directly, believing communication would strengthen their bond. Yet her attempts to solve problems appeared harsh compared to the mistress's quiet empathy. Where the wife sought resolution, the mistress offered relief. Where the wife asked for effort, the mistress asked for nothing. This distinction drew the husband toward the mistress with increasing frequency. He found that speaking to her required no defense. She absorbed his frustrations without adding pressure. She reflected his emotions rather than challenging them. When he felt overlooked, she whispered that she understood. When he felt misunderstood, she murmured that she wished others saw his gentleness. Every reassurance echoed exactly what he longed to hear. shaping her into the person who seemed to know him best. Over time, he began bringing more of himself to her. Stories of disagreements, private disappointments, lingering doubts. These were the conversations that once belonged to his marriage, shared in the quiet hours between husband and wife. But now, when tension rose between them, he sought the mistress instead. She became the filter through which his emotions passed, the interpreter who softened what he feared might be misread. He no longer felt compelled to share directly with his wife. The mistress offered solace without consequence. As this emotional shift deepened, the conflict between the couple began to pass through her. A simple household issue could escalate when filtered through his frustration and her gentle sympathy. She listened to his grievances, nodded with soft regret, and whispered that she hoped the wife would understand his intentions. She never criticized outright. She allowed implication to do the work. The husband, comforted by her understanding, interpreted her empathy as clarity. He trusted her perception more easily than he trusted his wife's. The wife noticed the change not in words but in distance. Her husband became slower to confide, quicker to withdraw. Arguments ended prematurely, replaced by quiet resignation rather than resolution. She sensed that her influence over his emotional world was slipping. Though she could not grasp the exact moment she lost it. Every attempt to reconnect was mirrored by his increasing retreat into the mistress's waiting calm. This erosion of emotional authority unsettled the wife more than any physical betrayal could. She had once been the place where her husband laid his burdens, where he softened after long days, where he sought the grounding that made him steady. Now, she watched as that role shifted to someone who offered comfort without sharing responsibility. The marriage began to feel like a structure lightened from one side, leaning toward whichever direction the husband sought ease. The mistress understood her growing power. Though she expressed no triumph, she maintained her quiet presence, ensuring every interaction reaffirmed her place as his refuge. She never demanded exclusivity. She simply allowed him to come to her, and he did, more often, more freely, with deeper vulnerability each time. Her calm became the emotional rhythm of his days, steady and inviting, in offering him a softness he believed was missing at home. She made herself indispensable. Servants observed this shift as well. They noticed how the husband's expression eased when he spoke to her, how he lingered in her presence with unguarded comfort. They saw how arguments between the couple seemed to evaporate into silence rather than resolve into understanding. In whispers, they acknowledged what the wife could not yet name. The mistress had become the emotional center of the household, even without authority. By the time the wife realized the depth of the change, her influence had thinned to the edges of his life. She remained by his side, but no longer within his inner world. The mistress now held that space, quietly, gently, and with a precision far sharper than any overt attempt to replace her. This emotional shift leaves the household leaning toward a softer refuge, as if comfort itself has chosen a new home. It creates a silence where connection once lived, widening into a gap no one dares name. From that widening gap, another influence prepares to deepen its hold. Across the dim corridors of a Tudor household, a mistress discovered that deliberate fragility could become a shield far stronger than open defiance. She understood that men, burdened by duty and pride, longed to feel protective, needed, valued, and necessary in ways that reaffirmed their sense of importance. So she shaped herself into a figure delicate enough to awaken that instinct, yet composed enough to hide the calculation beneath it. Her vulnerability was never chaotic. It was measured, quiet, and exquisitely timed. She allowed small tremors of softness to appear only when the husband was near. If he walked into the room looking troubled, she let her breath catch for a moment before offering a hesitant smile. When he returned from a tense conversation with his wife, she lowered her eyes, as though worried she might be imposing simply by standing there. Her gestures were faint, never demanding, but they pulled at him with the gravity of something he felt compelled to steady. This was her brilliance. She never asked for protection. She created moments where he chose to offer it. When she spoke of fears, her voice barely rose above a whisper. When she described loneliness, her words carried just enough tremble to stir something deep within him. She framed her struggles as things she tried to handle alone, as though she feared being a burden. The husband, sensing her restraint, moved closer. A man who believed himself strong could not resist the pull of someone who appeared to need him. Not in grand displays, but in quiet looks that suggested the world felt too heavy. Each time he intervened on her behalf, his attachment deepened. He began anticipating her needs, checking her expression when tension rose, offering reassurance even when she had not voiced distress. Her fragility granted him purpose, and purpose, once awakened, quickly grew into dependency. The wife, by contrast, carried the weight of the household with a steadiness expected of her station. She managed decisions, finance, to servants, conflicts, and expectations. Her strength kept the household running, but it left little room for softness. Her responses were efficient, her posture firm, her mind focused on maintaining order. Standing next to the mistress's delicate composure, her strength began to look like severity. The mistress exploited this contrast with meticulous care. When the husband complained of feeling misunderstood, she sighed gently and murmured, "She must be overwhelmed," framing the wife's firmness as evidence of emotional strain rather than responsibility. When he felt dismissed, she whispered, "I'm sure she didn't mean it." Yet her tone carried just enough sympathy to deepen his resentment. She made the wife appear unyielding simply by being soft. Soon, the husband began interpreting the wife's competence as coldness. A clipped answer seemed like irritation. A decisive instruction felt harsh. Her refusal to crumble under pressure was read as an inability to feel. Meanwhile, the mistress needed only to lower her voice, exhale softly, or glance away with wounded restraint to ignite his instinct to comfort her. She became the emotional refuge he did not realize he craved. Servants observed this transformation with growing certainty. They noted how the husband hovered protectively near the mistress, how she held herself slightly smaller in his presence, how her hands trembled just enough to appear overwhelmed but not helpless. They whispered that she was gentle, that the wife was stern, that the husband seemed calmer when he stood beside someone so ostensibly fragile. Their murmurs reinforced the narrative the mistress had already planted, yet she never exaggerated her weakness. Too much fragility would expose her. Instead, she offered controlled vulnerability, small gestures that fit perfectly into the role she crafted. A quiet sigh at the end of the day, a lowered gaze when tensions rose, a soft apology for not wanting to cause trouble, even when she had done nothing at all. These details accumulated until her fragility seemed woven into her very presence. The wife felt the shift almost imperceptibly. She saw the husband's impatience when she spoke with firmness, his protectiveness when the mistress's voice softened, his irritation when responsibilities overshadowed emotional reassurance. She sensed her influence narrowing, her authority strained by a softness she could neither replicate nor confront without confirming the narrative forming around her. Strength, once her anchor, became a disadvantage. Vulnerability, crafted, rehearsed, and refined, became the new source of power. By the time she recognized the strategy, the mistress had already secured her place as the fragile figure the husband felt compelled to protect. And protection, once freely given, rarely loosened its hold. This curated fragility leaves the household drifting toward a gentler imbalance, as though weakness itself has begun to pull the strongest person aside. It creates a quiet necessity, too subtle to question, yet too persistent to resist. In that shifting pull, another influence prepares to deepen its reach. Across a Tudor household shaped by hierarchy and unspoken rules, a mistress discovered the quiet force contained in a soft voice. She learned that influence did not need to arrive wrapped in command or sharpened by confrontation. It could flow instead through gentle suggestions, spoken with such delicacy that no one noticed the shift until the balance of the home leaned subtly in her direction. What she lacked in authority, she replaced with tone, steady, warm, and disarmingly modest. And through that softness, she began to rearrange the family around her. Her requests were never framed as demands. She chose phrases that sounded like passing thoughts. Perhaps it might ease his burden if dinner were earlier, she murmured, near a servant who carried messages to the wife. Or, I wonder whether he prefers quieter evenings. Spoken softly enough that the husband overheard. Each suggestion floated through the room without urgency, yet it lodged itself directly into the listener's mind. People acted not because they were told to, but because they believed they were responding to their own instincts. She applied this method with remarkable precision. When the husband felt restless, she mentioned the need for comfort. When he felt overlooked, she whispered, regrets that he carried too much alone. When the wife appeared composed, she observed, gently, that such strength must be exhausting. Nothing she said seemed dangerous. Her tone softened every implication, whether directed at the husband, the servants, or the shifting dynamics of the home. She shaped the atmosphere not by pushing against it, but by letting her words settle into its cracks. The wife remained unaware of the origins of these changes. She noticed that meals shifted earlier without explanation, that the husband requested quieter evenings after weeks of routine, and that servants approached her with concerns she had never heard him voice directly. Each alteration felt small, even reasonable, but together they formed a pattern, expectations transforming beneath her feet. She attempted to trace the cause, yet every thread dissolved into air. No one accused her, no one confronted her. The home simply began behaving as though someone else had spoken first. The husband interpreted the mistress's softness as intuition. When she suggested, in a gentle murmur, that he seemed tired, he believed she saw him more clearly than anyone else. When she noted that decisions weighed heavily on him, he felt understood. Her tone gave him the illusion that her thoughts echoed his own. So when these suggestions spread, carried through servants, or woven into household adjustments, he accepted them without question. He felt supported, not manipulated. Servants, too, responded to her softness. They took her murmured observations as kindness rather than interference. A quiet remark about a drafty hallway prompted immediate fixes. A softened concern about noise at night led to altered routines. They sought her guidance not because she commanded them, but because her tone carried a gentle certainty that felt safe to follow. Each adjustment seemed minor, but everyone shifted the household a fraction closer to her preference. Even when she addressed the wife directly, her politeness concealed intention. She offered comments, shaped like compliments. You handle so much with grace. I only hope no one burdens you further. The wife heard sympathy, but felt the weight of implication beneath it. Still, to question a gentle remark would appear unreasonable. The mistress's tone left no room for resistance, not because it demanded compliance, but because refusing such softness risked appearing harsh. Over time, the mistress's voice began to shape the household rhythm. Decisions aligned naturally with her suggestions. Rooms quieted when she whispered a concern. Schedules rearranged themselves around her murmured observations. The wife noticed that even her own choices now seemed to follow patterns she had not established. What once felt like her domain now felt curated by someone she had never permitted to influence it. What made the mistress's power particularly insidious was its invisibility. No one could point to a single moment when she had given an order or forced a change. Instead, influence seeped silently through the home, guided by a softness impossible to confront. A gentle voice, repeated often enough, can alter more than opinions. It can redraw the unspoken rules of a family. And so the household shifted, not with arguments, not with rebellion, but with the quiet slide of suggestion delivered in a tone too soft to refuse. By the time the wife recognized that her authority had thinned, the balance had already tilted. Not dramatically, not violently, but steadily, guided by a voice that barely rose above a whisper. This softened persuasion leaves the household subtly turning toward its quiet architect, as if gentleness itself has begun reshaping the center. It creates a chain of small shifts that feel accidental, yet pull in the same direction. Amid that quiet drift, another layer of control quietly settles into place. Across a Tudor household, bound by routine and hierarchy, a mistress learned that replacing a wife did not require grand gestures. It required presence, steady, quiet, and unchallenged. She understood that daily life offered far more opportunities to shift influence than any dramatic confrontation could. So she began entering the wife's spaces one small moment at a time, slipping into rhythms that once belonged exclusively to the lady of the house. The change was so gradual that few noticed it until the pattern had already rearranged itself around her. Her first steps were subtle. She appeared at the edge of important meals, offering polite assistance to the servants, never taking a seat, but standing close enough to seem helpful. Over time, the family grew accustomed to her hovering presence. Eventually, someone suggested she stay, just for convenience, just for tonight, just because she was already there. She accepted with a modest smile, positioning herself not at the center, but near enough to matter. Once seated, she made sure her demeanor remained calm and deferential, allowing others to believe they were the ones who had invited her closer. From there, proximity evolved naturally. She sat one chair closer to her husband during each gathering, always arranged by someone else, never by her own request. A servant placed a plate near her. A relative gestured for her to join them. The husband, without thinking, shifted his chair in her direction during the conversation. These incremental movements brought her into a space once reserved for the wife, close enough to hear his murmured thoughts, close enough to share glances that passed unnoticed by others. Nothing appeared improper, yet the distance between them slowly disappeared. She also learned to appear wherever the wife felt most responsible. If the wife oversaw the accounts, the mistress offered to carry papers or fetch ink with gentle willingness. If the wife organized household tasks, the mistress observed, offering soft suggestions, disguised as admiration. "You always manage these things with such skill," she murmured, while quietly absorbing each role the wife performed. Soon, servants began asking the mistress questions they once brought only to the wife, not because she claimed authority, but because she had made herself visible in the exact spaces where answers were needed. Her presence blurred the lines of responsibility. She helped arrange seating for guests. She accompanied her husband during garden walks that the wife used to lead. She lingered in the parlor when relatives visited, contributing small comments spoken with warmth and humility. These moments accumulated, reshaping the household's understanding of who belonged where. When she participated in tasks previously assigned to the wife, no one questioned her involvement. It had become familiar. The husband began relying on her without noticing the shift. He asked for her opinion in matters that were once private between him and his wife. He sought her company during meals, during preparations, during routine decisions that required little more than a reassuring presence. The mistress always answered softly, always stepped back when necessary, always allowed him to believe he chose her involvement rather than being guided toward it. Meanwhile, the wife felt the erosion of her place quietly but unmistakably. At meals, she noticed how the mistress sat where she once sat. During gatherings, she saw her husband turn instinctively toward someone else. in duties she once performed alone. She now found the mistress standing beside her, offering help she had never requested. These intrusions were too polite to challenge, yet too persistent to ignore. Every time the wife tried to reclaim space, she risked appearing possessive or ungracious. The servants adjusted quickly, as they always did. They offered the mistress small responsibilities. She was present. She was kind, because she asked nothing of them directly. They began informing her of schedules, routines, and household matters almost by habit. Their attention shifted subtly, pulled toward whichever figure seemed most accessible. Even the wife's attempts to assert authority backfired. When she requested the mistress step aside, the mistress smiled gently and complied with exaggerated humility. To observers, the wife seemed needlessly stern. To the husband, she seemed inflexible. The mistress's compliance sharpened the contrast between them. One woman strong enough to command, the other gentle enough to yield. Over time, the husband gravitated towards softness simply because it felt easier. The mistress's gradual replacement of the wife's role was never announced. It happened in shared tasks, in seating arrangements, in the unspoken acceptance of her presence during important moments. She did not need a title or permission. Familiarity granted her access. And familiarity, once established, is rarely removed without conflict. By the time the wife realized how deeply the change had settled, the household had already begun orbiting around a new center. One that smiled softly, stepped lightly, and occupied her place without ever seeming to reach for it. This quiet encroachment leaves the home tilting toward its newest figure, as if routine itself has reshaped around her presence. It creates a rhythm too familiar to question, yet too altered to reverse. Amid that softened rhythm, another shift waits to complete its circle. Through the shifting atmosphere of a Tudor household, a mistress discovered that pity could open more doors than admiration ever could. She learned that where charm demanded effort and confrontation carried risk, sorrow, gentle, restrained, and carefully measured, could move people without resistance. By allowing herself to appear fragile in just the right ways, she drew others toward her with instinctive concern. Her delicacy invited protection, and protection, once granted, rarely stopped at sympathy. She never permitted herself dramatic displays. True tears might expose intention. Instead, she chose subtler signs, an averted gaze at the perfect moment, a faint tremble in her breath, a soft swallow before she spoke. These tiny fractures suggested burdens too heavy to name, shaping her into someone who seemed perpetually on the edge of quiet suffering. People leaned closer not because she asked them to, but because her stillness suggested she might break without warning. The husband responded first. He began observing her with heightened sensitivity, noticing every moment when her expression dimmed or her voice thinned. Each delicate pause awakened something protective in him. A man accustomed to navigating duty and expectations found unexpected purpose in soothing her faint unease. When she whispered that she hoped not to trouble him, he reassured her with increased tenderness, insisting she was never a burden. His need to protect her grew with each soft apology, each fragile smile. The wife felt the weight of this transformation long before she understood it. Her own strength, once valued, now reads as harshness. When she spoke firmly, people cast anxious glances toward the mistress, as though expecting her to falter under the sound. When she attempted to restore order, the mistress lowered her eyes in a way that made the wife seem unforgiving. Even ordinary conversations shifted subtly. The mistress's quiet vulnerability accentuated the wife's composure until it resembled coldness rather than responsibility. Servants, ever attuned to emotional undercurrents, adapted quickly. They brought warm cloths to the mistress without being asked. They set aside small treats from the kitchen in case she had not eaten. They whispered that she endured private sorrows, that her sweetness hid wounds. that she carried sadness from a past no one had fully uncovered. The mistress neither confirmed nor denied these rumors. She thanked them softly, her silence lending credibility to their imaginings. Ambiguity served her better than any elaborate tale. Through this cultivated sorrow, she crafted an identity that protected her from scrutiny. Her fragility rendered her incapable of wrongdoing in the eyes of those around her. If she wandered into the wife's domain, they assumed she was trying to help despite her frailty. If she lingered too close to the husband, they believed she sought comfort rather than influence. Her emotional delicacy transformed manipulation into innocence. More importantly, pity reshaped the household's hierarchy. People deferred to her gently, adjusting expectations to accommodate her supposed sensitivities. They shielded her from conflict, filtered unpleasant news, and offered reassurances without understanding why. In comforting her, they inadvertently allowed her presence to expand. Every sympathetic gesture widened the space she occupied within the home. The husband's protectiveness deepened over time. When tension rose between the two women, he instinctively sided with the one who seemed more fragile. He accused his wife of being overly harsh, even when she spoke no differently than before. He softened his tone around the mistress, altered plans to prevent her distress, and made decisions that favored her comfort without noticing how often he did so. Her vulnerability had begun shaping his judgment. Meanwhile, the mistress hid her true intentions beneath layers of hesitation. She appeared unsure, overwhelmed, or quietly apologetic, allowing others to underestimate her. This concealment became one of her strongest advantages. People exposed their frustrations, secrets, and loyalties around her, believing she lacked the strength to weaponize them. Yet she stored each revelation with careful precision, aware that knowledge often held more power than authority. The wife felt increasingly isolated. Any attempt to question the mistress's behavior risked confirming the narrative spreading through the home that she was too severe, too controlling, too devoid of compassion. Even measured criticism made her appear cruel. She realized, slowly and painfully, that she had been cast in a role she had never agreed to play. The stoic woman set against a fragile innocent, and she understood that the more she defended herself, the deeper that contrast became. In truth, the mistress's fragility was never about weakness. It was architecture, deliberate, restrained, and strategically placed. Pity softened the household around her, creating openings she stepped through with effortless grace. What appeared delicate was, in fact, calculated. This crafted vulnerability leaves the household leaning toward its softest figure, as though sorrow itself has begun shaping loyalty. It creates sympathy too deep to challenge, yet too easily turned into influence. Beneath that quiet pull, another intention settles into place with growing confidence. Throughout the slow-moving rhythm of the Tudor household, the mistress learned to watch for fractures, those faint, hairline cracks in a marriage that no one else seemed to notice. She understood that destruction did not require noise, it only required patience. She waited with the stillness of someone who knew the exact moment to step forward. Not with force, but with a softness sharp enough to cut. Her presence remained gentle, her voice subdued. Yet everything she did traced a path toward a single, inevitable point. The collapse of a bond she had never been invited into, yet quietly claimed. Tension between the husband and wife always began as something ordinary. A disagreement about household expenses, a misplaced object, a servant failing to deliver a message. These small disturbances passed like changes of weather, unremarkable to most, but she watched them closely, storing each one as though they were threads she could pull later. She waited for patterns, for repeated sighs, for late-night silences where neither spouse spoke enough to bridge the distance. She noticed when the wife's discipline sharpened or when the husband's temper grew shorter. These shifts were signals, and she read them with a precision that bordered on instinct. When conflict finally deepened, she did nothing at first. She did not comfort too quickly or intervene too boldly. Instead, she allowed the tension to settle into the air, thickening the space between husband and wife. Only then, when frustration had worn into exhaustion, did she let herself appear, not as a solution, but as a presence shaped by quiet understanding. She stood nearby, spoke softly, and offered nothing more than attentive silence. Her restraint made her seem harmless, and harmlessness opened doors more effectively than persuasion. She never suggested anything directly. Instead, she let her words drift into the spaces the couple no longer filled with conversation. When the husband voiced irritation, she responded with gentle acknowledgement. When the wife seemed overwhelmed, she offered soft hesitations that hinted at concern. These were not opinions, they were shadows. Vague, shapeless remarks that allowed the husband to make his own assumptions. And once he believed those assumptions were his own, her influence deepened. The solutions she introduced never appeared self-serving. They arrived as questions, as soft murmurs of sympathy. Perhaps she needs rest. Maybe you deserve more peace. It might help if someone stepped in for a little while. Each suggestion appeared thoughtful, even considerate, yet all of them bent the situation toward a conclusion that benefited her alone. She positioned herself as the rational observer, the one who saw both sides without judgment. In doing so, she shaped the husband's perception while appearing to do nothing at all. The wife, increasingly isolated by these subtle shifts, found herself pushing against an invisible current. Whenever she attempted to assert her place, her words echoed differently, as though spoken into a room that no longer carried her voice with the same respect. Her concerns were interpreted as sharpness. Her caution sounded like distrust. Her effort to repair the marriage seemed exaggerated, next to the mistress's quiet restraint. Without understanding how, she became the figure everyone watched with a wary eye. Meanwhile, the mistress strengthened her alliances. Servants confided in her. The extended family praised her thoughtfulness. Even acquaintances outside the household remarked on her gentleness. These small impressions spread far enough that by the time deeper conflict surfaced, the wife already appeared unstable in comparison. The mistress had shaped not just private perception, but public expectation. When the collapse came, people believed they had seen it coming. She waited for the moment when the marriage reached the breaking point. An argument sharpened by exhaustion. A disagreement tangled with weeks of unresolved tension. She chose this precise moment to step forward with the quietest of offerings, a calm voice, a gentle presence, a suggestion framed as concern. You shouldn't suffer like this. There must be a better way. I only want peace for both of you. Her words sounded compassionate. But compassion was never her goal. She ensured the wife stood entirely alone. Every path the wife attempted to follow for support led back to ears already tuned to the mistress's softness. Every argument she made sounded harsher against the mistress's muted sorrow. By the time she tried to reclaim her position, the household had shifted too far to be corrected. The collapse did not happen through accusation or confrontation. It happened through exhaustion, worn edges, frayed trust, and the quiet pressure of someone who understood exactly where to stand when a structure was most fragile. What appeared to be a moment of chance had been shaped over countless quiet steps. What looked like natural decay had been patiently prepared. And in the stillness, after the fracture, the one who had waited the longest finally stepped into the space left behind. A smile can end a life that is still breathing, and inside a Tudor household. It could end a marriage long before anyone admitted it had died. The mistress understood this long before anyone else did. She moved quietly, waited patiently, and shaped the silence around her until it worked in her favor. And when the moment finally came, when the air settled, when the tension cooled, when the wife stood alone without knowing how she had become isolated. The mistress used nothing more than a gentle expression to seal what she had been building all along. No accusations. No declarations. No open victory. Only a smile. Soft and controlled, closing the distance between intention and outcome. The wife lost long before she realized she had been drawn into a conflict she never agreed to enter. She moved through the halls believing that order still belonged to her. That calm could still be restored. That loyalty remained intact despite the strain. She did not see how the household had slowly leaned away from her. One person at a time, shifting their trust toward the quieter figure who seemed too delicate to cause harm. She did not feel the change in the servants, the small adjustments in the husband's tone, the way conversations softened whenever the mistress entered the room. These shifts were subtle, woven carefully into daily life. Only when her footing disappeared beneath her did she understand how completely the narrative had moved without her. The mistress, one with silence as her shield. She allowed others to fill the gaps for her, to assume her innocence, to protect her from blame. She let her gentle nature become a wall that deflected suspicion and a mirror that reflected the wife's frustration at her. Even as she positioned herself closer to the husband, she appeared reluctant, hesitant, almost apologetic. Her restraint became a disguise strong enough to withstand scrutiny. She never pushed, never demanded, never asserted anything directly. People defended her without being asked. Offering sympathy, she did not openly seek. Her stillness made her appear harmless. Yet that same stillness allowed her to bend the household around her presence. And when everything had aligned, when the marriage had weakened, when trust had frayed, when the wife stood weary and misunderstood, the mistress offered the final gesture, a soft, composed smile that carried nothing outwardly sharp, a smile that could be interpreted as kindness, humility, or even sorrow. But beneath that calm surface, it marked the moment the household accepted her as the new center of its quiet orbit. The smile did not need to be wide or bright. Its power lay in certainty. She smiled because the struggle was already over. She smiled because no one would challenge her anymore. She smiled because she knew the husband would not turn away from the comfort she provided, nor return to the sharp edges of a marriage he no longer felt capable of repairing. The wife, standing nearby, felt the weight of that smile more deeply than any insult. It landed softly, without noise, but it held the finality of a door closing. She recognized then that she had been fighting a battle that never took place in the open. A conflict defined by softness rather than strength. She had brought reason to an arena shaped by emotion. She had relied on clarity in a space built on suggestion. She understood, at last, that she had been defeated not by actions she could point to, but by impressions she had never been allowed to control. And in that realization lay a quiet sorrow that even she could not name. The mistress did not look triumphant. She did not appear victorious. She seemed serene, composed, at ease with the world around her. Her smile was the final brushstroke on a portrait she had spent months crafting. There was no need for further movement. She had already taken everything she came for. The household responded accordingly, some with acceptance, some with pity, some with uncertain admiration. But all of them adjusted to the new shape of authority without resisting. The transition felt natural because she had spent so long preparing it to feel that way. Even the husband did not fully grasp what had taken place. He believed he had made choices based on reason, fairness, or emotional truth. He did not see how skillfully those truths had been arranged for him, laid out like stepping stones he believed he discovered on his own. He saw the mistress's smile as reassurance, as a sign of calm after prolonged strain. He interpreted it as gratitude, humility, even love. He did not recognize it as a victory because he never recognized that there had been a war. And in this house, this quiet, shadowed Tudor home where loyalty shifted on whispers and trust weakened by degrees. A single gentle expression marked the turning point. The wife stepped back. Whether by choice or by exhaustion, the mistress stepped forward, not with authority but with presence, and the household settled into its new order, unaware of how precisely they had been guided toward it. A smile ended the conflict. A smile rewrote the roles. A smile established the new balance of power. And within those still corridors, no one spoke of it again. The day dimmed, and the house returned to its ordinary rhythm. But something permanent had shifted beneath the quiet. A marriage undone, a position replaced, a life restructured, all of it sealed by the faint curve of a woman's lips. Now the night settles softly, just as the story finds its final breath. If you are listening in the silence of your room, let the calm spread across your thoughts. May your eyes grow heavy as the echoes of this Tudor household fade into the dark. Good night, and may sleep come to you gently.